Hello, this is On the Ledge podcast and I'm your host Jane Perrone, and this week we're getting a little bit weird. Yes, I know, we're always a little bit weird on this show, but that's okay because you know what? You and I both know that weird is what makes us special. In this episode, we're talking about a new book by University of Oxford botanist Chris Thorogood, Weird Plants. We'll be finding out why Stapelias like to make themselves look like mouldy carcasses, why Lowe's pitcher plant decided to evolve toilet-shaped pitchers, and why when it comes to the Titan Arum, bigger really is better. I'm just back from an incredible 2-day trip to the Netherlands visiting houseplant growers there, and boy do I have some exciting stuff to bring you in upcoming episodes. For my Patreon subscribers, I will bring you my first thoughts in the next few days about what I've seen, and then in upcoming shows I'll cover more of my discoveries for all of my listeners. Thanks to Jen, who became a Patreon subscriber this week. She signed up to donate $5 or more a month, and that gets her two extra episodes of An Extra Leaf, my Patreon-only podcast, every month. Plus lots of other sneak previews and a chance to comment on my new logo draft. And in the run-up to Christmas, I'll also be sending all my Patreon subscribers a special Christmas greeting. If you're a Patreon subscriber and you haven't yet put your postal address onto your Patreon details, please go and do that. I'll put details in my show notes on how to do that in just a couple of clicks. But now let's crack straight on with my interview with the wonderful Chris Thorogood. If you can, while you're listening, get a copy of the show notes at janeperrone.com in front of your eyes, because there are some wonderful images that go with the words in this book, painted by Chris himself. So if you want to see some of those, do check out the show notes so you can listen and look at the same time. Anyway, on with the interview, and I'll let Chris introduce himself.
My name's Chris Thorogood, and I'm a botanist at Oxford University Botanic Garden.
Chris, I've got your book, Weird Plants, sitting on my desk, and as soon as this arrived, my children were like, ooh, what's that, Mum? What's that strange plant on the front of that cool-looking book? I think this book is something that will appeal to anyone who's ever kind of watched a horror movie and become a bit alarmed by crazy, monstrous plants, or has ever written off plants as being boring, because actually this book is a brilliant piece of work showing us how fascinating plants can be. The first thing that struck me, though, was the illustrations. You did these illustrations yourself.
I did, Jane. Yes, I did. Yeah.
And are you a professionally trained illustrator, or was this a personal passion?
So I've always painted ever since I was very small. It's sort of something that runs in the family. So my father used to paint as well. And it's something that I love to do. So I'm very fortunate in my job that I get to see a lot of beautiful plants in their natural habitats. And I have this sort of burning desire after I've seen them to try and capture some of that beauty on canvas. So it's something that I suppose it's a bit of a hobby that I've managed to incorporate into my career.
And why was it that you wanted to do a book about weird plants rather than any other kind of plant?
I guess this is the sort of the underworld of the plant kingdom. We often think of plants as either being beautiful or a little bit inanimate. And some people think of plants and plant biology as boring. And I really wanted to turn that notion on its head and to really, in a way, startle people with these bizarre, strange, and sometimes even sinister plants that a lot of people might not have thought about or seen plants in that way. So I loved your opening question and how your kids were like, oh my goodness, what on earth is this thing on the front cover? Because that means it's doing its job.
We should answer that question. What is the bizarre plant that features on the front cover of this book?
Do you know, Jane, that ghastly looking thing, that's Hydnora africana. And it's a strange vampire plant, by which I mean it's a parasitic plant that steals its food from the roots of other plants. So it grows underground and it produces these strange cable-like roots. And from that, these absolutely bizarre mouth-like structures burst through the desert floor in southern Africa, which is where this plant grows. And doesn't it look menacing?
It really does. I mean, I'm sure there's a whole set of folklore associated with this plant.
And one of the things I love about that plant as well is that so little is known. So it's not really been successfully grown except from one occasion outside its native range, and very little is known about its biology. So for me as a botanist, I find plants like this just fascinating. There's so much more to do.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? That we see so many wildlife shows about animals, but where are the wildlife shows that focus on plants? There have been a few, I know, over the years, but I think we're getting undersold on some of these amazing plants, which is where your book comes in, of course, because in here are many, many wonders of things that are deeply odd. What's the oddest thing in this book that we should be looking out for? I mean, there's a lot of odd stuff in here. I mean, there are things that trap animals. There are things that stink to high heaven.
I know.
What's your personal favourite?
My personal favourite? Goodness, I think the one that I love telling people about, because I find the biology so fascinating, is it's a pitcher plant. And when we think of Nepenthes pitcher plants, which many of us are familiar with, we think of them as these passive traps that sort of sit there and insects are attracted and they fall in and they digest them. And I guess that's pretty remarkable in and of itself because they've evolved to be carnivores. But there's one pitcher plant, in fact, there are a handful of them, that have evolved a different way of acquiring nutrients. So there's one called Lowe's pitcher plant. It's named after Hugh Lowe, who encountered it on its native Mount Kinabalu in North Borneo. And this one produces these strange toilet-like pitchers, which is no coincidence because tree shrews climb onto the pitcher and eat the plant's nectar. And at the same time, and it's often the case that animals, whilst they eat, they excrete at the same time. And these tree shrews defecate. They basically poo into the pitchers, which of course is a wonderful source of nutrients because it's like manure effectively. And this was a relatively recent discovery. And I think it's really exciting because, again, it challenges this notion of plants just sort of sitting there waiting for things to happen. This is almost a plant that seems to have evolved this very bizarre and peculiar way of getting its nutrients in a nutrient poor environment. And I think that's just fascinating. A tree shrew toilet. There we go.
That is amazing. I mean, I guess it's a bit boring when you have that plant in not in captivity, but if you've got that plant, if you're growing it in a botanic garden, you're not going to be able to have tree shrews pooing into it. You just got to feed it boring old fertilizer or whatever. How do they?
I don't know. I've sort of toyed with the idea of taming a squirrel or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know how that works. There could be all kinds of strange activities going on around that plant. But you're right, that is absolutely incredible. And Nepenthes generally. I mean, I was reading about the Hemsliana species, which has a sort of a bat roosting function, which again, I mean, I can imagine sort of walking through, dense undergrowth and coming across, a bat flying out of a pitcher plant and just thinking that I'm in some alternative universe. What? How on earth does that work? How does the bat? It must be a small bat and a big pitcher.
I know, who'd have thought? So this is another pitcher plant that has evolved a subtly different way of getting its nutrients. And the bats, they roost inside the pitchers, and their geometry is optimal to house these bats. They're sort of elongated, and they've got a bit in the middle that the bats can cling onto. And just like with the tree shrew, they urinate and they defecate into the pitchers, which of course feeds the plant. And these are relationships that benefit both the plant, which gets nutrients from the animal, and the animal, which has a safe place to roost to hide from predators. So these, to us, bizarre relationships, they evolved under conditions where both the plant and the animal benefit. It's wonderfully intricate. And it's such a surprise for biologists because, again, this was another recent discovery. It's fascinating.
I can imagine putting the pieces of that jigsaw together as a botanist must be a very exciting moment to suddenly go, hang on a minute, I know what's happening here. That's incredible. And, moving on from defecating shrews, but keeping along the same lines, we've got these incredible plants which create a smell, shall we say, an odour. And some of these are things that we can grow indeed as houseplants. The Stapelias, I don't grow any myself, but I've seen many of my listeners have Stapelias. Tell me about this family of plants. Why are they producing a stink?
Do you know, I've got loads of these actually on my windowsill. I started collecting them years ago, and it's one of these plants that I keep on taking cuttings and I never seem to give them away, and there's probably a reason no one wants them, but my house is absolutely full of them. And in the summer when they flower, you'll want to put them outside because they smell absolutely hideous, some of them. Now, these are plants which grow in semi-arid areas of southern Africa, and they may grow in environments where bees, which we conventionally think of pollinating flowers, might be scarce. And that's because these flowers are attracting altogether a very different type of pollinator. So these ones are attracting flies. So effectively, these flowers mimic a dead animal. They're covered in fur, which looks a bit like the fur of an animal, or indeed mould, and they smell absolutely foul. And so flies are attracted to the flowers because they think it's a nice place to lay their eggs. And whilst they explore the flower, they pick up and deliver pollen, so they pollinate the flower. So this is a real fraudster because it's pretending to be something that it isn't, to enslave these pollinating flies. And again, it challenges this perception of flowers that we think of as something beautiful and something that we grow for our own appreciation. But of course, these are the sexual reproductive organs of plants. And this particular one is playing a nasty trick on flies to get pollinated.
Describe the smell. Is it like you kind of left your bin for 2 weeks and with a chicken carcass in it, and is it that kind of rotting flesh kind of smell?
It is. And you know, actually, when it's not that hot, you don't really notice it and it's not too bad. And some species are worse than others. I think there's one called Orbia variegata, which I imagine some of your listeners might grow. It's a fairly common houseplant. And it's got these wonderful mottled little starfish-shaped flowers. But that one really does smell revolting. They're not for the faint-hearted, but they're actually beautiful little succulents, and their stems are really velvety. And they're very easy to grow on a sunny windowsill. So I would recommend growing them if you can banish them to your outdoor area when they briefly flower.
With my mischievous mind, I'm thinking of all kinds of tricks I could play with this plant, like putting it in my children's bedrooms, or putting it outside the neighbour's house so they think they've got to clean the drains. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities that arise from these kind of plants. And this isn't the only plant family to do this kind of technique. I mean, not that this is a house plant that one could be growing, but of course the Titan Arum is the kind of the movie star of this particular approach. This is a plant now, especially with webcams around the world, that you can really watch the whole thing happening.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, why is it so big? Why does that plant need to be so large? Is there any reason that botanists have discovered, or is it just, hey, it's a monster?
So it's a difficult question to answer, and my view as a botanist is, so this is a phenomenon called sapromyophily, and basically it means that these are plants that mimic a dead animal or a corpse to attract pollinating flies. So it's just an alternative way of getting insects to carry out their pollination services. And flies tend to like big corpses because it's a bigger place for their developing maggots to feed. So this isn't very glamorous, I'm afraid. And so the bigger the corpse, the more flies you might be likely to attract. And so it might be that some of these horrible smelling flowers have evolved to be very large because they're mimicking an even better resource for flies to be attracted to lay their eggs. Something that's very large might be able to broadcast this disgusting stench far and wide across the rainforest, and then very effectively attract these pollinating flies. So that's a hypothesis.
Right. And I suppose the other thing is, compared to, say, the Stapelias, these are growing in presumably pretty fertile ground as well. So they've got the nutrients and the water in order to literally grow that large in the first place. They're in a good position to do that. I've seen them a couple of times in botanic gardens. Is it one of those plants that botanic gardens are like it's like the panda of the botanic garden world? You've got to have one to kind of draw people in. Is it as a showstopper?
Well, they do. I mean, people love them, and they come in their droves. Thousands and thousands of people come to see these things bloom because they're just incredible. I mean, if anyone's seen one flowering, they're just the sheer enormity of the inflorescence. It's incredible. They really are.
Yeah, and I love watching a webcam with these on, just, speeded up so you can see them actually coming to fruition is a rather wonderful thing. And as you say, I mean, that's a great thing. If you draw somebody into a botanic garden to look at that, then hopefully they'll look at some other things along the way and learn a bit more about how cool plants are. So it's a win-win. We'll be hearing more from Chris in a few moments, but first it's time for a short ad from a fellow gardening podcaster, followed by our Q&A.
Hello, I'm Sarah Wilson from the Roots and All podcast. On the podcast, I talk about gardening indoors and out with some of the most knowledgeable people around. Listen and find out the answers to things like why you should plant a tree in a square hole, not a round one, whether or not that fox that comes in your garden is going to try and eat your cat, why we've been growing alliums all wrong, why we keep killing our cacti and succulents, how we can deal with slugs if we don't want to kill them, why we as gardeners should be worshipping at the feet or bellies of earthworms, what you can expect if you hire a garden designer, whether or not you need a gardener and how much you should pay them, how to disbud dahlias, how to water your houseplants, what is biochar, what is the perfect tree for a small garden, what are the best plants for wildlife? Anyway, you get the picture. There's loads of great information for growers, so I'd love it if you'd join me for an episode. Find the Roots and All podcast on iTunes or your usual podcast provider, or you can listen direct from my website www.rootsandall.co.uk.
And now it's time for Question of the Week, which comes from Katie, and she'd listened to the mini episode on String of Hearts, Sarracenia woodii, during our Trailing Plants special week recently, and she had a question. She writes, I have a couple of these at the moment. They're placed next to a window on top of my kitchen cupboard so they'll trail down. The leaves keep going quite floppy and droopy, whereas I'm sure when I bought them the leaves were quite firm and strong. What would you advise? Ah, Katie, this is a good question. The thing to remember about Sarracenia linearis subspecies woodii, to give it its not so catchy full Latin name, this plant was first found growing in South Africa out of some rocks. In other words, this is a kind of a crevice-dwelling plant that likes to have its water supplied in short, sharp shocks with lots of drainage. So if you overwater it, it will go a bit floppy. Oftentimes people think that wilting is a sign of underwatering, but it can be a sign of overwatering too. And that is probably the case with this little string of hearts. Bear in mind this plant has these underground tubers which save lots of water, so it can go for an awful long time without needing any water because it can draw on the supplies in those tubers. That's not to say leave it bone dry all the time, but if you do keep pouring water on there, you will find the whole plant goes floppy. Depending on how bad it is, Katie, I would recommend taking this plant out of its pot and checking what the roots are doing, checking there's nothing mushy going on there, and repotting in some fresh houseplant compost with some added perlite to aid drainage, or even some cacti and succulent compost would be great. And going into the winter season, I would definitely recommend cutting right back on the watering of this plant. It will slow down in terms of growth, and if you add too much water, then the effect will be obvious on the plant. You may only need to water it once or twice a month at this time of year. And whatever you do, don't let the pot stand in water because that will be the death knell of this plant. So I hope that helps, Katie, and that your string of hearts is soon recovered. If you do find that the main plant is unsavable, then you can take some cuttings and pop them in a glass of water. I know it's counterintuitive, but it does work, and this plant will root very, very quickly, and you will be able to make new plants, even if the main plant can't be saved. Just try to pick cuttings from the stems that are the most firm and the least droopy, and you should have success. If you've got a question for On The Ledge, do drop me a line on theledgepodcast@gmail.com. I'm dying to help you stop your plants dying. See what I did there? And now back to my interview with Chris Thorogood, author of Weird Plants. We got onto the huge topic of the weird and wonderful world of orchids. Let's move on to something that is a bit more conventionally beautiful to us plant growers. The orchids. There's a number of really cool orchids in this book. That must have been hard to choose a few because there's so many different orchids with wonderful techniques for attracting pollinators. Which is your favourite of these ones in the book? I kind of like the Rothschild slipper orchid.
That's a really beautiful one. Yeah, I mean, I suppose we could have called this book Chris's favourite plants. So I had to sort of hold back on how many I could actually have time to paint. But the orchids are the masters of deception. So I talked a little bit about how these flowers trick and deceive their pollinators, and the orchids, my goodness, they really know how to do that. And so there are these particular little orchids called bee orchids, the species of Ophrys, which are very common around the Mediterranean, and they mimic a female species of insect with such acuity. So they really mimic the smell, the pheromone that these females produce, such that male insects think that it is a female insect who's ready to mate. And so these poor bamboozled, sex-crazed insects try to mate with the flowers, and in so doing, they pick up and deliver pollen. So they bring about pollination for the plant. So these are the plants that trick insects on a whole different level. It's so cruel.
You've got to feel sorry for the flies, really, but not that sorry. I mean, we also have to mention the plant that is featured on the opening page of your fraudster section. Now I'm going to have a go at the Latin name here. Psychotria alata, native central and south. This is a clean show, so I'm not quite sure how I can describe. Luscious lips.
That's the alternative name I use for it.
Yeah. You'll have to get the book to find out the more racy name for this plant, but it just looks like a big pair of lipstick covered lips. Does it? I mean, is it? I need to Google a picture of this. Have you hammed it up a bit here, or does it really look like that?
It's so funny you say that. Jane, because I was just about to say that's the first thing everyone does when they see this, because it's my painting of the plant, and everyone says, I'm going to Google this because I don't believe there's a plant that looks like this. Yes, it's Psychotria elata, beginning with a P, and yes, Google it, because I promise you this is what it looks like. It's extraordinary, just like a pair of lips.
Now I think about it, I'm sure I've seen this on, you get those kind of clickbait things of, you won't believe these plants on like weird ones. I'm sure I've actually seen this plant being mentioned before. Why is it? I mean, presumably it's not trying to look like a pair of lips. Presumably that's not part of its plan. What is its mimicry attempting to do?
It isn't actually. So this is an example of a flower, and there are a few in the book that happen to look very much to our eyes like something we're familiar with. There's another one called a monkey face orchid. There isn't a particular reason, a biological reason, that they happen to look like this. And actually, the structure that looks like lips is the calyx or calyx of the flower. So these bract-like structures. And the true flowers will grow through the middle. And once they actually develop, the illusion that it looks like a pair of lips disappears. So it really is just almost like a trick of the light. It just happens to look very much like that to our eyes. But the resemblance is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I think that's the trouble, isn't it? It's like, us naming constellations after things. We want to see something that we associate with in plants, don't we? And so that's why we make these associations. Exactly. I mean, I guess likewise that the Venus flytrap, we sort of make it into some kind of, I don't know what we're trying to say about Venus flytraps, but really the Venus flytrap's got a pretty clever system going to trap its prey. I'm always wondering how on earth that evolved.
It evolved from a hairy, sticky leaf. So what botanists like me are able to do is we can sort of piece together the evolutionary history of some of these plants by looking at the DNA. So we know from DNA sequence data, so rather like sort of DNA fingerprinting that we see on crime programs, we can work out which is related to which. And we know that Venus flytraps are, in fact, distant relatives of Nepenthes pitcher plants and also the sundews, the sticky-leaved plants that we sometimes grow on windowsills as well. And we're actually able to infer by looking at which plants are related to which, what the ancestral state was. So what the ancestor of these different plants look like. And we believe that it looks like a hairy, sticky leaf. So a little bit like a sundew, perhaps.
I wasn't expecting you to be able to answer that question, but I'm very impressed that you did. Well, that's really interesting, and that makes perfect sense. And in your book, you've got a picture of a trap with a small, I'm guessing it's some kind of amphibian in there or lizard in there. Do they really capture things as big as that?
They do. I mean, I suppose my painting makes it look a little bit larger and more formidable than it is. And the first thing that happens when I show people a Venus flytrap who haven't seen one before, which surprisingly, quite a few people haven't, and they say, "Oh, it's a bit smaller than I expected." But actually, tiny frogs and lizards, particularly juveniles that crawl into the trap, it can actually trap those, and it will feed on them. So this really is a plant predator, Jane.
I've got some Venus flytraps, and we did an episode on them last year, and they are quite. I mean, mine are outside in my sort of greenhouse cum potting shed, and they do have a nice diet of flies and stuff. There's not that many tiny frogs going in there, but I can imagine that they'd certainly have a go if they possibly could. And I guess this is one of these plants that people do tend to. They buy one for their kid and it lasts a few weeks and it dies. Do you grow these yourself? Are these a plant that you have, or do you find you have success with them?
Yeah, I do. I tend to grow them in fish tanks, actually. And I find that if you grow them under a little bit of glass and you give them lots of rainwater in a sunny place, they're actually very easy. They tend to, they don't like tap water in most places, as I'm sure you know. And they like a lot of light. And they don't like to be too wet in winter. And they're a little bit sensitive. So if you get one of those things wrong, then you can finish one off. But to be honest, lots of rainwater, lots of sunlight and high humidity, and they can just go forever, really.
And often I think the other trouble is that, curiosity gets the better of people and they end up triggering those traps. And as we know, once they've been triggered a couple of times, 3 times, they've kind of exhausted their energies and they're going to die off. So if that happens with all the traps, then, yeah,
They don't mind a bit, yeah, but I think if you if you did it every day, they might get a bit tired.
You're underestimating here children's ability to, to keep hassling plants. And some of these other picture plants that are pretty easy to grow, the Sarracenias. I think that's a plant that we should be growing more because actually it's pretty hardy and easy to grow, and yet they're not very popular. Tell me a bit about the Sarracenias.
Yeah, I think often, again, people try, and sometimes if they get something wrong, the plant dies, and then it sort of propagates this myth that they're very difficult to grow. And actually, if you understand what they like, they're really not that hard. I mean, Sarracenia purpurea is actually pretty hardy, as I'm sure you know. And the Darlingtonias, the cobra lilies, these are great plants to start off with and to try. And if you give them loads and loads of rainwater, you must never let them dry out in the summer and keep them cool and damp in the winter. They're really, really not that difficult. And these are also quite menacing, these plants. So Sarracenia flava, the yellow trumpet pitcher, scientists have isolated a drug that it produces in its nectar called conine, and this intoxicates insects that visit the traps looking for nectar to feed on, and it makes them drowsy and more likely to tumble into its abyss of digestive enzymes. So this is another plant that is a very menacing and sinister species.
Wow. Well, I don't like the sound of that. I mean, I guess that's the wonderful thing. Are there any of these plants that are going to be producing things that, this is a terribly human-centric thing to say. Obviously, plants aren't there just to provide us with stuff, but I always think that there's so many hidden treasures amongst these plants. Are we realising that some of these plants might actually have useful things in them that we can kind of then manufacture ourselves to do useful things for us?
Oh my goodness, absolutely we are. And in many cases, we're just scratching the surface. There are plants with as well as the medicinal uses, there are plants with certain surface properties that material scientists and engineers are very interested in, because we can learn from these properties. For example, we can produce materials that might be good for soaking up oil spills in the ocean, based on the surfaces of lotus leaves, for example, or water lettuces, plants that have super water repellent surfaces. And we can even infer properties from these surfaces of carnivorous plants. So the slippery bit of the Nepenthes trap, engineers are very interested to know just what makes it so slippery and how we can control fluid behavior on a lubricated surface, which effectively is what this is, because insects aquaplane off it into the trap. There's so much we can learn from plants, and I think we just need to look a bit harder, and also to conserve plants, because as we're all aware, we're losing some species at an alarming rate, and unless we conserve them and understand them, we may never know what properties they have that are useful to us.
I'm sure some of these plants that you've actually got listed here are endangered. Are there any of these that are really on their way out that we should be worried about the future of?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a positive way of looking at it would be that Mount Kinabalu in Borneo is a wonderful mountain where so many fantastic plants grow, and a couple in the book grow there. So Rothschild orchid, which we mentioned before, grows only on that mountain, as does Nepenthes raja, the king pitcher plant. They only grow in the Kinabalu National Park. I think now, because we understand how rare they are and the importance of conservation, they're heavily protected, and also they can be grown via tissue culture, which means people are less likely to go and loot them from the wild. Nonetheless, there are many plants in other habitats that are much more vulnerable and susceptible to extinction because they don't have the same conservation measures in place, and that's a real worry for us.
You've got 129 pages in this book, Chris. Sorry, not 129, 119.
Have I?
Now, how did you select the plants for this book? I wonder, were there any that you didn't have room to include that you just wish you'd managed to fit in?
Yes, I mean, there are so many plants that could have been featured in the book. I wanted to give as broad a selection as possible. There are some plants, in fact, that I've since writing the book, I've actually found out about, that I thought, my goodness, I wish I could have included that. There's a tiny little flower that when I was in a tropical island in Japan, the botanists there told me about, and it's a very, very rare blue flower that hardly anyone's ever seen. It's called Oxygena, and there are only 6 different species in the genus, a couple of which are extinct already. And so little is known about this very peculiar flower, its biology, what pollinates it, and it's so bizarre looking. It looks like some strange sea creature. And I thought when I discovered this, my goodness, I wish I'd put that in the book. So maybe the next edition.
Yeah, I was going to say you might have to have a part 2 to this.
Exactly, weirder plants.
Exactly, and obviously working in a botanic garden, this is a great place to publicise your book. When you've done events around this book so far, what's the most common reaction that people have given you, or common question that you've had?
I hope that people see plants in a slightly different way, because I guess coming back to how we started our conversation, some people think of plants as beautiful and ornamental, which of course they can be. A lot of people think of plant biology as sometimes a little bit dull or irrelevant. So we often think, when we think of plant biology, of photosynthesis or things that we've learnt about in school. But really, I'd like to showcase a different side to plants and plant biology, and to show people just how fascinating plants can be. Often when I talk to people about conservation, if you mention an endangered species to someone, they'll tell you about pandas, tigers, that kind of thing, rhinos perhaps. But I've never met anyone who, if you ask them about an endangered species, will give you the name of a plant. And the reality is that some reports suggest that up to 1 in 5 plant species worldwide is threatened with possible extinction in the future. And that's a very alarming fact for botanists. And so I take my role very seriously in trying to inspire and galvanize a new generation of botanists who can go out there, understand what plant species we have, and prioritize their conservation. So I guess underlying the what seems like a sort of frivolous and light-hearted theme, I think there is an important message about how important plants are, and we must understand, celebrate, but also conserve them.
Tell me a bit more, though, about the work specifically that you do at Oxford Botanic Garden. Are you involved in day-to-day care of the plants, or is it research? What's your main focus?
Yeah, so I do research. I'm from a research background originally, and I'm very interested in the evolution of plants. So earlier, your question about how a Venus flytrap evolved, those are the sorts of questions that I love to answer using a range of different tools, often lab-based, although sadly I don't spend any time in a lab anymore because I used to really enjoy that. And so I work with people from different disciplines like mathematicians and engineers to try and answer questions about how plants work. So that's the sort of the research part, which I love to do. And I'm also involved in some conservation work, which I love. So I get to visit some fantastic places. So earlier this year, I was in Japan, and I got to visit an island called Okinawa, which is full of wonderful subtropical rainforest. And to see some of the plants that we're so familiar with, that we grow in our homes, growing in the wild, that's always such a wonderful experience. It really is without compare.
Do you get to interact with the public at all at the Botanic Garden? Do you kind of, oh gosh, I can just help this person answer this question they've got about what they're wondering, why this plant is doing this? Do you ever kind of just, tap someone on the shoulder and say, well, I can explain that to you? Or would that take up too much of your day?
No, well, I mean, Oxford Botanic Garden, it's a public place. And actually, we're very lucky because it gives us an opportunity working at the Botanic Garden to engage with many thousands of people every year. And as I mentioned, I take my role very seriously in educating and engaging people with the importance of plants. And actually, that mission is made a little bit easier because so many people come to our beautiful garden every year. And so by putting up interpretation boards, by giving talks or lectures, we have a wide-ranging audience that we're able to engage with, which makes that mission accomplishable.
I've got a lot of American listeners, and I've had quite a few emails from people saying, "Oh, I'm coming to the UK. What gardens should I visit?" And also for obviously people in the UK, tell me what the kind of the highlights are of the Botanic Garden at Oxford for anyone who's coming, possibly with a bit of a houseplant obsession. Are there things we should be looking out for?
Yeah, so Oxford Botanic Garden is a wonderful place to visit. It's a relatively small garden compared with some of our gardens here in the UK, but it's a very diverse and compact collection. So it is a botanic garden, and we have several thousand different types of plant. We have, again, some compact glasshouse collections for the houseplant lovers. But one of the very interesting things about Oxford Botanic Garden is its history, because it's the oldest botanic garden in the UK. It's nearly 400 years old, and it was first established as a physic garden to grow medicinal plants and to educate students about the medicinal properties of plants and to make sure that they prescribed them correctly. But really, it's just steeped in so much fascinating history. So within those four centuries old walls is a lot of wonderful history to absorb in a beautiful setting. So I would very much recommend people come and visit.
Oh, that sounds awesome. I haven't been for quite a few years, so I think that's a trip that I should be making. I went to Cambridge Botanic Garden not that long ago, so yes, I can't let that lie. So I will come and visit you, I promise.
Please do.
And it's fantastic to talk to you. I've got one more question which I'm gonna foist on you because I forgot to ask you, so apologies that I haven't given you any warning, but I want to ask all my guests in the run up to Christmas what they want Santa to bring them that might be houseplant related for Christmas. What one gift would you like to have? It could be a plant, it could be a piece of equipment, it could be a pot. What would you like to have to open on Christmas Day from your houseplant loving Santa?
Yeah, you have sprung that on me. And the first thing that came to mind, it might sound a bit strange, but I have a greenhouse in my garden, and that I've recently acquired, and I've always wanted a greenhouse, as you can imagine, ever since I was a little boy, and I never had one. So I had lots of fish tanks and terraria on my windowsill. And now that I have one, I want to make it into a little veritable rainforest, and I'm really excited about that. And what I'd love is a trough that I can put in there to make a sort of tropical pond during the summer months that I can festoon with all sorts of interesting plants like lotuses and papyrus and hanging baskets. And you get the picture. So that's what I really want. I want a trough for my greenhouse.
Okay, I'm sure that Father Christmas will be able to supply that, to fit that in his sleigh for you this Christmas, Chris. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been fantastic, and I love this book. It's so much fun. So thanks so much, Chris. This week's show, and you've opened your eyes to more crazy plants that you could be growing in your house. Just don't blame me when all your relatives get sick of the stench of your Stapelias. I'm planning an upcoming episode on how to take good photographs of your houseplants. So if there are things you want to know from the experts about how to get a good shot of your plants, do let me know. And also tell me who your favourite photographers are on Instagram. I'd love to get a list up in my show notes highlighting some of your favourites. I'll be back next Friday for more houseplant fun and frolics. I'll see you then. Bye! This episode featured Roll Jordan Roll by the Joy Drops, An Instrument the Boy Called Happy Day Gakana by Samuel Corwin, and Water in the Creek by Josh Woodward, all licensed under Creative Commons. See my website for details.